Very, very good morning. As you'll rapidly tell from my accent, I'm a Brit, so treat me nicely. I come in peace. I'm a friend. I also studied at Cambridge University, the other one, so it's kind of nice symmetry coming together here for me personally. I really enjoyed both Dan and Nehal's speech, and it was really interesting to me the crossover between some of the themes in the permissionless world into the permissioned world. And what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, is just share some perspectives from work that I'm doing and my teams and colleagues are doing in Accenture, helping enterprises to capitalize on this innovation. We're working in a permissioned environment, and there are pros and cons between the two different families of permissionless and permissioned. But one of the things, as I said a few seconds ago, that's intriguing is interoperability, scalability, security. These are live topics, absolutely, across the whole landscape. And it's really interesting watching how the sort of enterprise environment can capitalize on this extraordinary innovation frontier that we're seeing in the permission space. I'm going to use the word enterprise to mean corporate, sort of business, if you like, but also to cover elements of government and even the philanthropic, third sector, where we're trying to help people, like, for example, work with the UN with refugees as a use case there we could perhaps talk about at some point. A really crucial thing is that if you're running an enterprise, it's really important that your business flows are properly governed and controlled. In fact, the world depends on enterprises having integrity in their business flows. And that, I think, then sets the stage for some really important requirements that become considerations in enterprise leaders as they start to, A, go through the learning curve, but then look to see how to capitalize and generate value from this new technology. And I've listed here amongst the top 5 topics that I think are interesting, or certainly very interesting to our clients, in terms of considerations as they start to say, okay, I've now got my head around what this technology might enable, what needs to be true for me to be able safely to apply this and to start to adopt it, in turn to unlock value in my business. So 5 ideas, and I'll try not to drain this too much because it will get heavy quite quickly if we're not careful, but operational integrity, let me start with that. If you think of a flow of information or a process flow through a business, and then invariably across other businesses in the end-to-end serving of a customer, it's fundamentally important that you can govern that, you can control that, and you can operate that in a manner that's predictable with integrity. If you can't do that, then you're running a bit of a sort of maybe. And as I said a few seconds ago, the moment you're running a sort of maybe, then the integrity of your business starts to get challenged, and your whole ability to actually capitalize on this technology in turn gets compromised. A closely allied idea is this concept of operational support. I need to be able to know how much it's going to cost me to run my systems. I need to know what service level my system is going to be operating at. Borrowing from Dan, maybe I need to operate at 10,000 transactions a second. I need to know I can deliver that. Otherwise, I'm not running a credible business, and I'll be put out of business. And again, please remember my language. This could be a government department. It could even be a philanthropic agency. So operational support and the concept of having somebody to call when something goes wrong is really fundamental, I think, in the permissioned and enterprise environment. A third idea that I'm flagging here is this concept of data segmentation or segregation. And we would definitely, I'm sure, play with this over the course of today. There is a school of thought in some areas which says encryption is probably sufficient to provide the security of data in a corporate environment. My own experience, and very strongly echoing the experience of almost all the major thought leaders in the enterprise space that I work with, says that is not going to be good enough. We can't rely on encryption alone to ensure data is absolutely safe within the context of, say, a competitor or a different government agency, a different government in a different country. Therefore, the concept of segregation as well as encryption is absolutely fundamental, and that's a really key architectural point in terms of the design of distributed ledger type systems, or capitalizing on some of the original innovation from blockchain. The concept of onboarding is also pretty fundamental. In many businesses, it's absolutely essential. I cannot interact with a hospital unless they're very sure they know who I am, and I am who I say I am, and they're right in giving me some of the data that they're going to give me, and I'm giving them data back. Analogously, if I'm Goldman Sachs, God bless me, there's no way on God's earth I want JP Morgan Chase to have any way at all of being able to see my proprietary competitor data. Now, that's maybe a bit of an extreme example, but there are many, many other instances where you get to that stage where you say the only way you can be confident that you are allowing the right people to see some of the data in your environment is you have a procedure and a process and a mechanism, which may be regulated or not, to ensure that you've onboarded customers into that environment appropriately. And lastly, echoing very much the conversation or the discussion we were having just a few minutes ago, these environments need to scale. In many cases, we are talking, again, as Dan said, we're talking about businesses that might require tens of thousands of transactions per second. And that requires a sort of configuration and design that eliminates a lot of ambiguity that you might see in other sort of solution patterns. So in the permissioned environment, scalability comes to fore very quickly. And I want to just give myself a little shout out. We did some very interesting work with DTCC. In fact, Neha and I were at a conference earlier this week with Mike Botts and his team at Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation in New York. I mean, this is an interesting, sort of systemically significant organization for the world, but certainly for the US in particular as well. It clears maybe 100 million to 150 million transactions, securities transactions a day. Any of us that have got savings or pension schemes, we all kind of care that that works. And one of the exam questions that we teamed with them on from Accenture was, could it be viable that you could imagine a distributed ledger type environment across the market participants in Wall Street that would operate at that sort of throughput? And we proved that it could. We proved that it could, which is actually public domain. We've published papers on the subject, which is not a trivial topic in the early stages of the thinking there. But this technology in a permissioned environment is not rate constrained now by scalability. You can architect for some of the most demanding environments, including things like Visa, as again Dan said. But let me move us on to a few other thoughts, because the combination of these 5 attributes, in my experience, are the things that cause business people or government leaders to stop and say, well, hang on a minute, how's that going to work? Explain to me how these types of requirements are going to be met. And that's what in turn leads us to say, let's capitalize on and benefit from some of the extraordinary innovation that's going on in the permissionless space, but let's then adapt that into different sorts of architectures and implementations, be they DLTs or shared data constructs, however you want to configure it, to make sure we respect these. In turn, there are some other ideas that flow in terms of considerations from a permissioned environment. Let me unpack some of them. This concept of centralization versus decentralization can get very confusing, and I think it's often depicted as a sort of binary choice. You're either a centralist or you're a decentralist. And I think that's really flawed. I think in general, in most business flows, you'll see a combination of centralized and decentralized type componentry. It's not a question of one thing or another. And a thought that often goes in parallel with that when looking at how the permissioned environments are starting to adopt some of these technologies, there's also a school of thought that I hear quite often that says, well, you're just creating silos, you're creating walled gardens and ecosystems that are constrained. Now, I can see where that line of thinking comes from, but I would argue actually quite the opposite. The application of DLT in the enterprise environment is rapidly smashing down silo walls within consortia or groups of businesses or entities who've got an interest in cooperating in a more effective way, and therefore have a sort of, if you like, a club. We've got a set of rules, we've got a set of governance, we've got a set of mechanisms, and we will then take down some of the walls. And I'm sorry to go back to Wall Street because I'm sure it won't be a popular analog for some people, but if you look at how it works today, operationally, and the settlement processes, it's quite breathtaking how crudely we've just sort of automated the wheelbarrow in the street that was previously wheeling tickets from one office to another in the 1960s. It's extraordinary. We've basically done exactly what we all know is done, which is just automate an analog process and just do it as it was. Take a DLT type environment, and again, conversations with DTCC will relate here, whereby they say, hey, imagine a single golden version of the truth. Imagine those 5 criteria I just set out that you could all trust and believe. Now, would you be prepared to imagine a scenario where you don't need to message between each other? You don't need to reconcile. You don't need a digital wheelbarrow. Well, guess what? That concept alone would unlock something approaching $8 billion a year of wasted cost. And when you click underneath that, and that's just Wall Street, I can very rapidly go to other ecosystems. So silo walls are being knocked down in this context, but they are creating new little ecosystems, if you like. That would be, say, a capital market settlement ecosystem
There'll be health ecosystems. There'll be automobile ecosystems. There'll be a whole bunch of ones which straddle across industry sectors that traditionally are quite separate today. And as I'll come on to, and again, Dan alluded to very importantly, the ability to be able to interoperate across those ecosystems is also fundamentally important. So let me pick that up. We've done some primary research with Stevens Institute, Professor Athanasian. We're really proud of it. And again, it's public domain, and we're about to open source our thinking to Hyperledger Quilt. But there are mechanisms that in a permissioned environment can be envisaged relatively quickly that will enable you to say, okay, I really want to connect my supply chain, my trade finance, and my insurance ecosystems. I chose those examples because it's a live example of something that people are thinking through. I want to be able to dynamically price the way I insure a ship based on whether or not it's going around the coast of Africa and it's getting into horrible weather or maybe worse, versus it's going another way and it's actually not such a big deal from an insurance point of view. I want to be able to join those ecosystems up. But there's an insurance ecosystem, and there's a shipping ecosystem, and there's a trade finance ecosystem. These are intrinsically clubs with rules of people who are sharing data in a very crude way today that can actually be powered up in a very powerful way in the future. I'd urge you to look at Hyperledger in general, actually, and some of the ideas that are flowing in there, because they've actually done a very nice job of capturing some of the ideas that can then be reapplied across the business or a wider environment. And Quilt is just one example of that for interoperability. So tokenization. Tokenization has been around as long as we can remember. You can go into the Stone Age and find tokens that were representatives of value. And it's an exciting frontier. But I really, really get pumped up when I start looking at what we can do with the application of DLT technologies in tokenizing different types of objects that currently exist in our society. And I'm only going to glance at this subject, but it starts with money. And again, a lot of the cryptocurrency space has doing pioneering thinking, which we can all capitalize on. And it may well be in a permissioned and enterprise environment, we adopt a subset of some of those ideas. But we're doing some work which I sort of want to talk about a lot more than we really can, but we've published what we can about this concept of central bank digital currency. And Neha, you referenced this earlier this week, I remember, in New York. It was great seeing completely independent threads following the same logic. There are some profoundly exciting things that could be done. If you said the central banks of our countries, the Fed here in the US or the Bank of England in the UK, if you said, today we run cash and coin, it's extraordinary to say it, but we still do run cash and coin, and there are physical, bullion centers where those things are locked up. That's like a tiny, tiny sideshow with respect to the total volume of throughput, certainly, in the sort of small single digits %. Most of money that goes through central banks is digitized. It's balances, it's transactions that are recorded on traditional technology. The concept of introducing a third rail that says, hey, central banks could offer a mechanism whereby central bank digital money is tokenized is a brand new idea that's coming to fore very rapidly. So this is the application of a subset of some of the ideas in the permissionless space in the central banks that would enable things like delivery versus payment in capital markets. And I won't go into that in detail right now. But suffice to say, the finance sector could get very excited with the interaction between that concept at the central bank level with the wholesale banks. But then perhaps much more relevant for society at large is the concept of digital twins more generally. And this is a really extraordinary space, which is rich with texture, and I won't go into it in detail right now, but suffice to say, the concept of saying something that you could digitally trust is an absolutely perfect emulation of a physical object, like an aircraft engine, and then start to do things with that digital twin is really quite profound, and we might want to talk about that a little bit later on. We're seeing three patterns in sort of macro level or bordering on Mickey Mouse level of detail, forgive me if it is, but in the enterprise space. The first pattern is the one on the left, which is where, and again, sorry to keep giving them a shout out, but I do have a huge amount of respect for this organization. At DTCC, thinking through, they're the, if you like, the hub of a market. They set rules, they help enforce governance, and they set standards, and everyone interacts with them. They're in a really strong position to say, hey, we're thinking about some future concepts and constructs. Here's a way in which, if you like, our existing tribe, our existing club, could move to a new operating model and really an exciting space. The second one in the middle there is actually a lot harder to get going, and there are plenty of examples of train crashes in this space, to be perfectly honest, because broadly what we're talking about here is taking people or companies or businesses that are fundamentally competing with each other and saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could get around a room and get around a table together and invent a new way of working that would be to our collective advantage? And you have that usual dynamic of cooperation with competition that can actually stifle some of that. But I want to give a shout out to the Risk Block Alliance here in the US, which is a group of 30 plus major insurance companies. They've done exactly this, and they will be implementing new protocols and new ways of working powered by permissioned blockchains in the course of this summer here in the US, which I think will profoundly reduce the cost for all of us ultimately as end users of insurance, but also be a gateway to brand new products and ideas. And last and not least is this concept of saying where there are installed bases of standard software, for example, enterprise resource management type software like SAP or Oracle, they effectively set a standard. And you can start to envisage companies who are both using similar application stacks, be they enterprise or vertical stacks, effectively joining up and integrating their value chains using DLT technologies to sit underneath, if you like, to provide a framework that joins these all up. So let me wrap up. In the permission space, we're adopting a lot of the ideas from the permissioner space. We see intrinsically huge amount of value, both in efficiency, but also in innovation and new sources of revenue, and new products and services. But fundamentally, I want to end with this thought, which is, this is really, in the enterprise environment where I'm representing today and where I'm working every day, this is now rapidly graduating from being a technology topic to a topic in the smaller point there, which is, it is actually about business model transformation. And it requires as a prerequisite that we've got an understanding of the tech, and that means in turn people running businesses need to understand what the tech can do for them, because this is a trigger for strategic business model transformation. And if you aren't in front of it as a business leader, you need to worry about that a little bit, because others are, and we're rebuilding the landscape with this technology. Many thanks for listening. Thank you.